Hello, everyone. This is Jonathan Little for PokerNews.com. Today we have a fun hand from a $10,000 buy-in main event. This is from the LAPC that takes place every year at the Commerce Casino. It's always a really big tournament and a lot of fun. So this is not a re-entry tournament, which is a little bit relevant because in re-entry tournaments, if people go broke early, it's often not the end of the world to them because they can rebuy or re-enter. So in this one, it's a standard freeze-out, which actually is not that common of an occurrence anymore. So I tend to be a little bit more aggressive early in these tournaments if I think my opponents are going to be very inclined not to go broke. So that's going to lead to me 3-betting a little bit more before the flop. So with this hand, ace-7 suited, facing a 300 raise at 50, 100 on the button, I'm going to be 3-betting this the majority of the time. If the players in the blinds are particularly bad, I'll call. But if I think this player is good, the initial raiser, and I think the blinds are good enough, which, maybe they are, maybe they aren't, I'm going to be 3-betting this to about 900. If the players are all bad, I'm going to be more inclined to call. So anyway, I do 3-bet to 900, and loose aggressive kid calls. Flop comes 10, 7, 5, 1 diamond, 2 spades, and my opponent checks. So this is a spot where a few years ago, everyone just blindly continuation bet with their entire range every single time for about 2/3 pot. And I think that's a little bit of an error. I don't think it's horrible to bet with this hand or even with your whole range, but I do think that sizing is a little bit too big. If you are going to bet, you probably want to bet about a third pot with most of your range, just because you should have a range advantage given we re-raised before the flop and our opponent just called. He didn't 4-bet. So presumably that should remove a lot of the best hands from his range, although maybe he does slow play. Anyway, this is a spot where in the past people would bet 2/3 pot and go from there. But here, I think we really have two decent options, especially with our exact hand, but also with our whole range. And that is to either bet 1/3 pot with most of our hands, or we could check with some of our hands and bet with, a different part of our range. In this scenario, I'm usually going to be checking with my marginal made hands and then my hands that are absolute garbage. But if you notice, there really are very few absolute garbage hands on this board besides stuff like Queen 9 of hearts. But even then, that could conceivably be bet as effectively a draw. Typically, I'm going to be betting with my best hands and my draws. So given that, I think this hand is not quite in the best hand range. Notice we could have some 10s, and we could also have all the overpairs and some of the sets. So there are plenty of better made hands in our range to the point where I think it's fine just to check this. As your middle pair gets worse, you should become more inclined to bet because you don't care if your opponent folds out hands like, Queen 9 of hearts, for example, right? If my opponent told me he had Queen 9 of hearts, and I thought he would never bluff me if I checked behind, then I should definitely bet and just make him fold that hand because that hand's going to outdraw me some small portion of the time. So anyway, this is a spot where I'm usually going to be checking. The presence of a diamond on the flop makes this an even nicer check because I can very easily call on many more turns, although I'm going to be calling on a lot of turns anyway. This is a spot where I'm just going to check behind and try to get closer to showdown before value betting. So check on the flop. If the turn's a low card and my opponent checks again, I'm definitely going to value bet at that point. But here we get a pretty nasty turn, the king of spades. So if we bet now, we are trying to get called by various spade hands, but a lot of those various spade hands are going to be spades like Queen 9, right? With a queen of spades or something like that. A lot of those hands are going to have some additional draw with them, like notice Queen 9 has a gut shot straight draw. And a lot of those marginal draws may be inclined to check raise me. Also, my opponent may check raise with top pairs for protection, which I don't think is necessarily a good play, but maybe that's what he does. He may check raise with his 2 pairs, maybe with his flushes if he has some flushes. So I don't think I need to bet at this point. While there is merit in protecting my hand, clearly all overcards are bad and all spades are bad. I think it's fine just to keep checking. And this may seem a little bit weak to some players, but when you have a marginal made hand, you want to play a small pot. And how do you play a small pot? Well, you check. Sometimes you get outdrawn, and that's okay. It is okay to lose the pot 25 or 30% of the time. You have to be content with that. So on the river, we get a 6 of hearts. My opponent checks again. So now is there any merit in value betting? Well, what are we trying to get called by, right? We're trying to get called by a 6, which should be pretty unlikely if my opponent raised and then called a 3-bet. The only 6s that make a lot of sense here are like ace 6, which, we block an ace. He could also have 7-6, but we lose to that. He could have 6-5, but we lose to that. He could have 8-6 suited. I guess that makes sense. He could have 9-6 suited. but some of those hands just bet the turn. So really, we're not going to get called by very many sixes. He could have a 5. He could have ace-5, but again, we block the ace. He could have 6-5, we lose to that. 7-5, we lose to that. He could have 5-4. I think that's a hand that makes perfect sense. But would he really call a bet with 5-4 here, or maybe 5-3 suited? Probably not, right? Would he call pocket fours? Probably not. Would he call with ace-queen? Probably not. So there really aren't very many better made hands that we could conceivably, or there aren't very many worse made hands than our pair here that we could get called by. I didn't mention that maybe we could have a hand like 8-7. I guess that's a hand that could call, but again, we block the 7, right? So we block a lot of the hands. When I say we block, it means we have cards in our hand that makes it less likely that our opponent has that hand. So if we have a 7 in our hand and there's a 7 on board, well, now there are way fewer combinations of 8-7 as opposed to if I did not have a 7 in my hand. So always be aware of that. Also mention how the ace blocker hurts us when we're trying to find calls from ace-5 and ace-6. So this is a spot where I think we just need to check. I mean, there may be a little bit of value in going for a small bet here, and I could actually see betting 25% pot being perfectly fine, especially if you think your opponent's going to check raise really wide with a lot of bluffs. We can bet small and then call a raise. Or if we think our opponent's going to be inclined to call with perhaps ace-high or pocket fours if we do bet tiny. So maybe there's a little bit of value in betting, and given we are very deep stacked, maybe that's worth going for. Let's see if I do that. This time I do just check. And, I think this is fine. We flopped a medium made hand when we ended up playing a small pot. We were against exactly 5-4 suited, which does make a lot of sense. This is a hand that our opponent will certainly want to check down because if he bets and gets called, well, he's going to be in bad shape. So I think we both played this hand fine. Clearly, I could have perhaps gotten one street of value, but notice that that's against exactly my opponent's hand, which is kind of unlikely. There are only 5 or 4 combinations of 5-4 suited before the flop to even start with. And then once the flop comes with a 5, there are only 3 combinations left then. So it's a pretty small range I'm trying to get value from, like 6-5 and 5-4. So I'm okay with this hand. This hand really just does demonstrate that you don't have to do anything too incredibly fancy, and you don't have to bet every time you're checked to. Just check down with your marginal made hands and go from there. And like I said, if the turn was not a particularly bad card, and especially if it was a lower card, obviously a 4 I would have bet, so I would have been in trouble there. But I would have gone for value on some turns. So this hand could very easily go from a marginal made hand on the flop to a decently strong made hand to value bet on the turn, or from a marginal made hand on the flop to now just a even more solidly marginal made hand, which is what happened this time. So that's going to be it for this hand. Hope you enjoyed it. Make sure you follow me on Twitter at Jonathan Little and let me know if you're enjoying these videos for Poker News. Make sure you follow Poker News on Twitter as well. They have a lot of great content there and they keep you up to date on what's happening in the poker world. So thank you very much for watching, and be sure to check back next week for another educational poker hand.